Okay, hello everyone. My name is Mia Sturdivant, and I am the Marketing and Communications Assistant for the School of Data Science here at UNC Charlotte. I would like to welcome you all to the sixth annual Charlotte Women in Data Science virtual conference hosted and sponsored by UNC Charlotte School of Data Science and Lowe's. The With Charlotte Conference initiative aims to inspire and educate data scientists across the region, regardless of gender, and to support women in the field. With the current state of the world mainly interacting online, we are so grateful for your decision to attend our 2-day virtual event and show your support for our various speakers. I'd like to extend a special thanks for all of our attendees for showing up and showing your support. And I'm now happy to introduce our speaker for the hour, Safiya Noble. Safiya works as the associate professor at UCLA, and she is the co-founder/director for the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry.
Good morning. Thank you. I guess it's almost afternoon for you all. I'm joining you this morning from Los Angeles, California, where it's about 8:15 in the morning. And I am just so thrilled to be here to meet you all and to engage in a bit of a conversation about my work and your work. And so, how I was kind of thinking this morning might go would be that I could talk a bit about my work and how I kind of came into the work of information science. And then I'd really love to spend some time interacting with you, responding to your questions. So please be thinking about some questions and put them here somewhere where I can find them or where Mia can find them, and we can power through those this morning too. So first, let me just start by saying that it's been amazing to watch the explosion of this kind of field of data science, which in many ways is a field that's so interdisciplinary. There are many people who do data science now. I think of my friend and colleague, Dr. Raman Chowdhury, who was the head of ethical AI at a place like Accenture, and she has a PhD in political science. Right. So that's not really the kind of place or field that you would expect a data scientist to come from. But she's, amazing in statistics and statistical analysis. I think of my work where I train data scientists, certainly at UCLA in the Department of Information Studies. And I come out of the field of library and information studies, or library and information science. So there's, I think, so many different ways that people are starting to come at this field. And I thought maybe I would share a little bit about why I was interested in this and the kind of work that I do, which is less computational, but maybe a little bit more social science and even in some cases humanities oriented. But of course, there are now these amazing burgeoning fields like digital humanities, where there are plenty of data scientists kind of working at the intersection of the humanities and statistical analysis or computing. So I guess I'll start a little bit at the current moment and work my way back a bit. I currently direct the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry with my colleague, Dr. Sarah Roberts. And, we think of this as a place that we didn't have when we were graduate students at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. When we were graduate students there, we were thinking about um, the internet and digital media and computing platforms. Both of us have been on the internet for a very long time. Uh, I'm embarrassed. I'm gonna start give myself a coughing attack when I think about how long I've been on the internet. Um, I think I got my first email from my friends in the National Society of Black Engineers, NSBE, in 1989. I want to say I was right around 1989 or 90. So I've been on the internet for a long time. I can tell you when I got that email address, I thought, this is terrible. Who would ever want to sit at a computer all day and type their thoughts when you could just pick up the phone and call someone? Um, I still feel that way about email, by the way. uh, who wants to do it. But, and I will say that I'm waiting for my friends in engineering to come up with something better than email as a way to organize our human connections around work. Having said that, we both had been on the internet for a very long time. I was, engaged with computers when I was in high school. Now you have to remember this is in the 80s when personal home computers were really not ubiquitous the way they are today. It just so happened that my mom was a graphic designer and a typesetter. And so she had one of two Mac classic computers, Apple computers at home where she did offset printing and typesetting and graphic design. This was unheard of, people didn't have these. And she had one and her colleague had the other one. I remember them driving to San Francisco to buy them. So, you think about how far we've come to 2021, where, in the United States, um, among middle class people, for the most part, they're there's a kind of ubiquitous yeah, all this PageMaker, right? I mean, Quark Express, all of it. It's just hilarious to me, right? So, you think about now where we are, where many of the kinds of ways that we thought about um, computing are so different because we have more computing power in, a mobile phone than we ever had in the early days of computing. But I remember by the time that I'd had my full career in advertising and marketing, and the kind of 2006 to 2008 recession was starting, it was really the right time to go back to graduate school and reinvent myself and my career. Um, and so I pursued a master's in library and information science and then a PhD in the same field, mostly because it was the most interdisciplinary field that I could find where I could engage with people who were interested in computing. Even though I was not interested in coding, I mean, I had taken a stab at it. And I will tell you that people who are coders are a special breed of human. There's just something about the way the brain is wired that really where you have a you know a flair for that kind of detail and that kind of work. But of course, working with programmers, even though I didn't do a lot of programming, um I realized there were so many kind of the minute they were writing code or designing websites or architecting a big site of thousands of pages, that work was a social experiment. It was social work. It would be applied in social ways. And that is really the place where I found a thrill um, to think about. And I can remember, for example, doing user experience design while I was in graduate school. I worked at a tech company in Urbana, Illinois, which is called Pixo now. Um, at the time, it was called OJC. And I can remember talking to programmers that I worked with every day, and it would say, well, when I tested this website with these users, the path you thought they would take is not at all the path that they took, because that's the exciting thing about UX design. And, we would have these really robust conversations about how things should be labeled, what they should be called, what people's experience with these technologies would be like, and how it was really different than sometimes the way they imagined. And so while I was doing that kind of work and I was in graduate school, I was thinking about our kind of engagements with digital technologies, the internet, quite frankly. And there was, it was a moment when um, Google had come to prominence as kind of, people thought of it as like the people's technology company. It had incredible marketing and advertising, and um, there were people who thought that Google was a nonprofit. I still to this day meet people who think that Google is a nonprofit, which is stunning to me. Um, excuse me. Uh, and uh, at that time, um, I had just left the kind of advertising industry. And so I really related to Google and Yahoo, in particular, those two, as advertising companies, because we were doing so much work to try to kind of game the system and keyword purchase. And this is just in the early days of search engine optimization, of trying to get your clients' products and services and messages to the first page of search. So I was already a bit suspicious about thinking about search engines purely as information portals or as a replacement for the library, which of course is a very popular way that people talk about Google and YouTube, Google search and YouTube. And so this really led me down the journey and kind of into this world at that of research that eventually became the book, Algorithms of Oppression. So let me say a word about that. Algorithms of Oppression is a book that documents many, many, many cases where people search for banal things or search for questions to more complex issues that are happening in society. And what I did in that book was, which was really the outgrowth of my graduate work, was to see all the times that um, search had failed. And when I say fail, I mean it had just fallen flat. And in fact, in some cases, been dangerous or um, unfair, profoundly unfair. And this is one of the reasons why I named the book Algorithms of Oppression, because the results that I was finding, and it's amazing now when I go back and I just kind of look and see some of the things that I documented in that book. When you write a book about a tech company, it's you basically hand them a big book of tickets. And for those of you who've worked in the tech space, a ticket is something when there's a problem, a technical issue or any kind of issue. You all open tickets all the time when you pull down a system and you put in kind of, I'm having a problem with X, Y, or Z. That's a ticket. And so my book has become a big book of tickets, and Google's really gone through and tried to solve a lot of those problems. But prior to that, there were egregious things. For example, if you did a keyword search on the two words Black girls, you were met with almost exclusively pornography on the first page. Now, you didn't have to add the word sex. You didn't have to add the word porn. You didn't have to add any other word. Black girls were just synonymous with pornography. Of course, I found this incredibly egregious. My daughter at the time was, my stepdaughter was about, I don't know, 12 or 13. I had a whole staircase of nieces younger than her, thinking about what does it mean when they're on the internet and they look for themselves, they do searches for themselves, and they're met with this kind of representation, misrepresentation, quite frankly. Still to this day, and I've written about this in various places, even outside of the book, where if you look for Latina girls or Asian girls, you still will often find this kind of hypersexualized content. And so the question is, for me, was, well, how do minoritized communities, people in the United States, but even more broadly, control their own identity markers in advertising spaces where there's a 24/7 live auction happening through AdWords and kind of the keyword planning tool, which is the backbone that drives Google search, where people are bidding to associate their content with certain keywords. And of course, in this case, for many years, many, many years, the porn industry really controlled the keywords around girls of color. And so this was a fascinating kind of foray for me into this work of thinking about how it is that programmers, for example, who are working in search in Google Search Lab, miss that, right? How is it that the kinds of questions that I might ask were really different than the kinds of questions that get asked in this user experience or design phase before something actually makes it to market? So this has really been the impetus for my work, has really been documenting the kinds of harms that come to vulnerable people through their use and engagement with different kinds of digital technologies, and more importantly, kind of taking on the outsized role that large scale multinational information corporations, advertising corporations hold in kind of the zeitgeist, and how they've come to displace other forms of knowledge, right? Other kinds of sites of inquiry. So the library being one of them. Um, what's the role of these companies in displacing public media or other kinds of resources, um, public schools, universities, and so forth? And I think the questions, and maybe I'll close here and open up. I hope that you'll put some questions into the chat or somewhere where we can find them. Um, I'll just say that I think one of the biggest challenges before us is that we're living in a moment, especially now during COVID-19, where um, technology is playing such a daily and important and increasingly naturalized part of our lives, right? Where, school is on Zoom, university is on Zoom, work is on Zoom. If you have kind of a middle class existence in the United States. And I think we want to ask ourselves, what does it mean that in this moment where we see that a pandemic has rendered us so vulnerable as a country, um, uh, many of our kind of democratic institutional counterweights to technology have really, really been weakened. So that we have a very weak public health sector. We have a weak public media um, sector, which, of course, when you start talking about reliable information that you could act on or use during a global health crisis, that there's a kind of this significant distrust of a lot of different kinds of corporate media. Um, this, of course, is incredibly concerning. We have a collapse almost in this country over the last 30 years of things like investigative journalism and a trust in what we call the fourth estate or journalism as a way of helping to educate the citizenry and the residents of the country. um, this is really important. And we have a constant kind of funneling of people back into social media and internet companies as kind of the site of truth. And I think these are really interesting questions that are in front of us. I think there's a lot at stake, especially for vulnerable people, for people who might be on the losing end of the way in which these technologies can also be organized and weaponized against vulnerable people. And of course, I know you all know so much about that in terms of Facebook and social media. So um, it's great to be here, and I want to be in a conversation with you about your kind of your own aspirations around data science and information and society, technology and society. I would say this is the most important and compelling dimension of our lives for me in my chosen path here. I will tell you that one of the reasons that we know so much about the harms, let's say the underside of the way in which technologies are designed and deployed unfairly, things like algorithmic oppression and discrimination, technological redlining, digital redlining. Um, we know about these things because of the incredible work that, quite frankly, so many women of color, LGBTQ scholars and journalists have done for the last 15, 20 years. And I feel proud to be part of that tradition. But I will tell you that even as we have worked so hard to bring these conversations into the mainstream, I mean, of course, you see every week a news story about some type of harm that has come through AI or algorithmic discrimination of some sort, that we really have to stay earnest and develop this area, this field, because just as soon as these issues come into view, they're kind of captured by the very companies that are kind of implicated, and then they reimagine and redeploy those same words back out into the public and position themselves as kind of the champions um, of taking on these issues. So a lot of work to do here, and it's so fascinating. And I think I'll just look here to the chat for a minute and see what kinds of questions are coming up. And Nia, I don't know if you have any thoughts too, but I'm going to take a pause here.
Yeah, I can read these out to you if you like.
Great.
Yeah. So Katie asks, what steps do you suggest we take from a technology and data standpoint to start rebuilding the trust between the public and those in power, aka the media or our local government?
Well, I think, the trust is really, it needs to be cultivated around our relationships to democracy, our relationships to civil rights and human rights. Those are actually the values that have been weakened. And, I'm of the ilk of believing that this should be kind of less about strengthening our trust in the technology and rather strengthening our trust in values around, for example, civil rights and human rights, and uh, how we organize and distribute resources and goods and services in our society. We have come a long way from the society of my grandparents, let's say, kind of a post World War II generation that was really actively involved in thinking about reimagining democracy in a way that might include rights for everyone, broader civic participation for everyone, um, uh, that where there was a much higher degree of trust in government because government was understood to be reflective of people and various publics, and it was a mechanism for collectively building the country. And of course, we know it's been incredibly uneven. I mean, I certainly um, talk very much about the kind of gross um, and racist dimensions of the way in which public policy has worked in this country. So we know we're not fooling ourselves to think that women or people of color were broadly included. In fact, they were not. But the struggle over those ideas of inclusion, of participation, were really important. And so I think that these things are what have really broken down. And I guess my concern is that we are increasingly turning more and more agency for making crucial decisions about our futures to technology companies, and really thinking that the technology is going to somehow solve these things rather than the kinds of values that and messages, discourses in our society about who to trust and who not to trust. And of course, those things are incredibly dangerous. Um, you know, we are living in a time where lobbyists for multinational corporations have an outsized voice. Companies have an outsized voice relative to other sectors of our society, like the public. And those are things we're going to have to grapple with. And I think those are really, we can point to those power relationships as really deeply implicated in the breakdown of trust and the rise of kind of, a backlash against civil rights, which is, of course, the moment that we're living through now.
Okay, someone else is asking, how much can we blame social media and search engine companies for these issues? Playing the devil's advocate, aren't they simply reflecting the deep-seated flaws already present in our society?
Well, no, they're not a mirror of society by any stretch, because they are, for example, in a world where we're not using social media, if I say something inflammatory about another person, I say it to as many people as will listen. That's not really going to be that many people. As a professor at UCLA, I'm going to have an outsized voice compared to others, but it's not going to necessarily be amplified to millions of people with speed and scale. So that's actually a really important thing, that the technology companies are profoundly implicated in the speed and scale by which some of the most harmful ideas in the world circulate. Calls for genocide, um, calls for ethnic cleansing, calls for brutalization of African Americans, misogyny, um, organized hate. That happens and is facilitated by technologies. So, no, I don't think it is just a mirror. I think it actually is a mechanism for exponentially amplifying the worst. And let me just say that the worst is also often what goes viral, even with people who disagree with ideas. They will still engage with those ideas. And that means that that engagement is a profit. Um, it's a profit regime for these technology companies. They make the most money off the most inflammatory kinds of content, and they don't disambiguate either between. They use words like content that really flatten our ability to make sense of, is it racist propaganda, or is it evidence-based research, or is it something in between? Well, who knows, because it's all content. So that is actually very different, because in offline, we often have a context for understanding where we are coming into engagement with an idea. It's in our church, it's in our family, it's at school, it's at work. We have different rules of engagement in those spaces, different contexts. So we make meaning of it in different ways. That is very, very different. All that context is taken away in something like a social media company. So I would argue that those are very unique excuse me, technologies that do something that's actually much more predatory and hostile, in the way in which it kind of operates and displaces and kind of takes over other spaces of engagement where there might actually be a way to correct and solve and say, well, hang on, those aren't the facts. You can do that at the dinner table in a way that you can't do when it's on YouTube and it's gone viral and 2 million people have seen it.
Gordon is asking, in your book, you suggest that the way to get past the help ticket problem is to embed Black studies or other scholars into design teams and give them real power. But the closest example we have of that recently, Google's AI fiasco and their abuse of firing Timot Gibru, shows that there's going to be a real resistance to that. So the question is, what sorts of ways forward you see?
I love this question, Gordon, and I think it's so interesting to me because to me, Dr. Gibru is not a Black studies professor. She is a Black woman and she is a computer scientist, and so her own training is not in the social sciences, right, or the humanities in terms of Black studies, and and even in trying to, within her own discipline, that is the discipline that her peers are working in CS at Google. And for those of you who don't know the story about Dr. Tamit Jabru, she's a Black woman computer scientist. She was the head of kind of the ethical AI division at Google. And she was recently fired a few weeks ago by Google when she raised concerns about the basically the kind of natural language processing technology that her and her team were looking at and evaluating. And she said, there's some problems here we need to address, because this technology is actually ripe for racist and sexist kinds of output. It's going to be a kind of a dangerous technology. It's going to be harmful. And this is after many, many months of her raising red flags and saying, this is just unacceptable that we are developing products with this kind of technology. And eventually, she said, I just kind of can't work under these circumstances. This is untenable. And they took her criticism, which was her job to do as the head of AI and ethics at Google. And they said, oh, okay, well, we accept your resignation. So just completely a gaslit response to her concerns and the concerns of her team. And so, yeah, here we have a person who's not even raising like the situating, let's say, those concerns in something like a Black studies tradition, but it's just talking about the tech, how it works and how it's discriminatory, and how to kind of was inclined in that way. And I encourage everyone to follow this story. It's a very important story, and there's some very good MIT Tech Review wrote a very good short article that summarized what happened and what the concerns were. And so, yes, you're right. I mean, if Dr. Jabru cannot be taken seriously by the leadership of a company like Google, because to do so would be to, you know, undermine their new products that are in the hopper, then we're in trouble. We're not going to, we're a long way away from hiring a PhD in Black studies or ethnic studies or gender studies to sit at the table. And of course, one of the things that I argue, Gordon, to your point in the book, is that there should be equal shared power so that the computer scientists don't trump the social concerns, the social dimensions of implementation, right? And this is something I even tell my undergraduate students all the time. I say, you have no business designing technology for society, and you know nothing about society. You don't take any sociology courses. You should have a double major in some type of social science, in my opinion, if you're going to study engineering and computer science, because you don't even understand the context within which these things will, the many, especially if you start talking about global technologies, the many contexts within which these technologies will sit, and they will be different in different places. They'll be taken up differently, and they will be used differently, and there will be different kinds of power regimes and governments in places where these technologies work. So you have to actually understand those things. And so Dr. Jabru's firing, and the firing of her kind of key interlocutor at Google now, Dr. Mitchell, signals to us that there are profound limits within many of these companies. And when you start to address issues that might affect the bottom line, that the bottom line will win over the people that may be harmed. And this is why this work is so incredibly important. And we are all in solidarity with Timnit and pushing and her work. You might be familiar with it. She was part of a study called Gender Shades, which was the definitive study that helped us understand that facial recognition technologies, for example, don't see Black faces, and they especially don't see Black women's faces, cannot make sense of of who we are. And this is really important work that's happening in the world.
Okay. We have another comment and question from Heather. This kind of touches on your last point. She says that it seems like better / more collaborations between humanities and STEM fields can help ethical tech design, but forging / fostering those collaborations within academia can be a real challenge when grant sources are focused on non-humanities oriented outcomes. What might be some solutions for one, academics to facilitate collaboration towards ethical tech, and two, industry endorsement of such collaboration?
It's such a great question. I will tell you that not only do we need to forge more of these relationships between social science and humanities departments and engineering departments, um, we've got to remember that we have lived now under a solid 20 years of STEM, right? That STEM is the way to the future. And I know I have STEM degrees. Okay, so I understand that this like hyper focus, and especially for communities of color, that we redirect, a lot of our energy into STEM fields. And I think that's important. We should be there. But I think we should not be in an either or situation. And this goes back to my previous comment about design for society. You have to know a lot about history and society and sociology and cultural studies and ethnic studies and gender studies to really understand society. So I think that the humanists bring so much to the table in particular. And of course, the field of digital humanities has been a really important intersection of people who are interested in computation and the humanities. But even there's an uneven power balance where the computational side of the house, so to speak, often is foregrounded because of exactly what you said, because NSF, the National Science Foundation, and other big funders are interested in computation, funding computation. They're not interested necessarily in the potential broader impact of things like harm. Now, I will say that it's been amazing to me to see over the last decade of even my own work, how things are changing. 10 years ago when I was writing the dissertation that became the book, um, if I said, which I did at conferences, that technology can discriminate, that it's actually discriminating at the level of code, that values are getting written in at the level of code because decisions get made. And I knew this because I had worked with coders. So I knew we were debating over how to design things and which way to go. And then they would program it. So I knew that. And and yet, even when I talked to the programmers about it, they would say, well, no, that's not that. I'm just doing math. And other, world class, scholars would also say that um, programming at the end of the day is just math, and math can't be racist. Well, this is such a hyper reductionist argument, right? This is like saying human beings can't have judgment because human beings are just cells, and cells can't discriminate, right? I mean, this is ludicrous. So I think that humanists are making such important contributions. Now, fast forward 10 years, I mean, you can read about a racist algorithm, like I said, in the news on a constant kind of basis. But 10 years ago, when I was saying that, was like falling, no one wanted to hear it. So we've made a lot of progress, is what I'm saying. And I think a lot of that progress that's pushing on fields of computing has come from the digital, it's come from the humanists, it's come from the social scientists. And so we know the impact is there, but that of course there's a gross uneven distribution of resources and funding around that work. So we still have a lot of work to do.
I can add in a question. Um,
Okay.
what role do you think that something like representation would play in first of all, the STEM field and how that could foster more ethical technologies and systems?
Well, this conference is such a great example of why we, organize ourselves, around different kinds of identities or concerns or kind of shared values. Um, Even if you're not a woman, you can care about the way in which data science and technology affects women and girls. So I think that representation is incredibly important because sometimes our lived experience is enough to um, inform different kinds of questions. Excuse me. All right. Um, I can tell you that I think in our fields, especially around data science and information science, that we still have very, very low levels of representation of women of color. When I got my PhD in information science, like I said, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, um, I can't even keep track anymore. Um, the I was the only Black woman and the kinds of kind of questions and things that I was thinking about. I did it. My background was in sociology and ethnic studies, my undergraduate. So it was hard because there weren't a ton of people who could pick up some of those concepts. They had never heard of Black feminist thought or the Black feminism. It was just like, oh, you know. So I think, what I would encourage people to do is to remember that in some areas we are still integrating. We might be among the first or second generations to show up in some of these programs and some of these jobs. And so it's really important that we do that work and, not be discouraged. I often tell Black women in particular who enter my field to, imagine themselves in the 1950s. That might be what it feels like sometimes in some of these spaces. Very hard, very harsh. Um, and it's really important that we show up and still press on and make a difference in these spaces. I never would have imagined that a book like Algorithms of Oppression would make much of a difference, but I feel like I've moved my grain of sand a little bit down the beach and opened up now, a lot of other conversations. And so I know my representation has made an impact for other people to also speak their truth and do their research and bring it forward, and there's space. So we're always making space for each other. And I'm learning now from a whole new generation um, of you all who are pushing the boundaries and doing more and learning more. And I think that's really, really important in every field that we representation matters, doing this work matters, and also being in a space of power to implement um, uh, other ways of knowing is also really important.
Thank you so much. If anybody else has any final questions before we end, please put them in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, let me just say, while we kind of wait to see if anything comes through, that I want to really wish you a great, great conference and all the work that will come from this gathering. Really, these connections that we make, these conversations, there's always like a nugget of something in some of these things for someone. And um, I want to encourage you to um, think about you've got many of you have a lot of career in front of you. It's a long distance run to pace yourselves. There will be times where you feel your work is difficult. There may be times when you pivot and do new things. Where you are is exactly where you're supposed to be. So, I just say, I just want to encourage you and wish you a really wonderful conference and great connections. And I hope that you will stay in touch with us. We're at UCLA at the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. You can find us on Twitter. You can find it. You can subscribe to our newsletter at our website at UCLA. It's c2i2.ucla.edu, C2I2 like R2D2. And stay in touch. It's really great to have been here with you.